3 days after open heart surgery, my son blocked my number. I had no one to pick me up and no money for a cab. I was about to walk 40 miles home when my surgeon stopped me. "You saved my life 35 years ago," he said, handing me an envelope. "Now stay in my mansion. Your son will regret abandoning the man who befriended the richest doctor in the state." My name is Thomas Reeves, and I want to tell you this story the way it actually happened, not the version where everything makes sense in retrospect, not the version that sounds like a lesson, the real one, the one where I was 64 years old, sitting on the edge of a hospital bed trying to calculate whether I could survive a 40-mile walk on a chest they'd cracked open 4 days earlier. I was a postal carrier for 37 years. Columbus, Ohio. I walked somewhere between 8 and 12 m a day, depending on the route. Rain, SLE, ice. So thick it turned sidewalks into something you navigated rather than walked on. August, so hot the asphalt went soft under your boots. My knees started complaining seriously around year 28. By year 34, they were in open rebellion. I finished out anyway because the pension didn't fully vest until year 37, and I needed every dollar of it. I retired at 62 with enough to cover rent and groceries if I budgeted carefully, which I did because I had always budgeted carefully. I lived in a one-bedroom apartment on the east side of Columbus with a bathroom ceiling that leaked and a cat named Gerald who died the winter before my surgery and who I still missed every morning when I made coffee and he wasn't there to sit on my feet. I don't tell you this to make you feel sorry for me. I tell you because I want you to understand where I was standing when all of this began. I wasn't a man who'd been ground down by bad luck. I was a man who'd made choices, real choices, deliberate ones. And the life I had was the result of those choices. I chose to give everything I had to my son. I chose to go without so he could go further. I made those choices with my eyes open, and I don't regret a single one. What I didn't choose was to be alone in a hospital room after major surgery with my son's number blocked in my phone. That part one didn't see coming. Marcus was born in 1985, which means he was 7 years old when his mother died. Her name was Sarah. She had brown hair and a laugh that made strangers turn around in restaurants and smile without knowing why. And she died of an aneurysm on a Tuesday morning in March while Marcus was at school, and I was on the Riverside route between Maple and Chestnut. By the time I got the call and made it to the hospital, she had already been gone for 2 hours. I picked Marcus up from school that afternoon. I sat with him in the parking lot for a long time before I said anything. And then I said, "Your mom died today, and I'm so sorry, and I love you, and we're going to be okay." He asked me if I promised. I told him I promised. Then he cried with his head against my shoulder, and I held him and made that promise real in the only way you can make a promise like that real, by deciding in that moment that I was going to spend the rest of my life keeping it. I don't know how other people handle grief and single parenthood simultaneously. I only know how I handled it, which was to put one foot in front of the other every single day and refuse to stop. I worked my route. I made dinner. I went to parent-teacher conferences and Little League games and school plays where Marcus had 3 lines and delivered all of them like he was reading from a tax document, which made me laugh so hard I had to cover my mouth with my program. I helped with homework I mostly didn't understand by going to the library the night before and reading ahead. The money was always tight. not desperate. There were people around us who were genuinely desperate. And what I had wasn't that, but tight. Constantly, carefully tight. I had one good winter jacket and wore it for 15 years. Marcus never wore the same jacket 2 winters running because he kept growing. I clipped coupons on Sunday mornings. I packed his lunch every day because cafeteria food was $225 and I could make a peanut butter sandwich and an apple in a juice box for less than $1. None of this felt like sacrifice. At the time, it felt like math. It felt like love expressed through addition and subtraction. Marcus was a good student, not effortless. He worked at it, honors classes by middle school, AP by high school. He got a partial scholarship to Ohio State. I took out a small loan to cover the gap and paid it off in 4 years. Law school at Capital University. On another partial scholarship, he graduated at 27 and got an offer from a firm in downtown Columbus with marble floors and a dress code and partners whose names were on the building. He called me from outside the front door on a Tuesday afternoon, standing on the sidewalk in the suit I'd helped him buy, and said, "Dad, I'm going to be an attorney." I said, "I know, son. I've always known." The visits home became less frequent after that. I understood. He was building something. He married Vanessa in 2017. Polished professional. Not warm exactly, but not unkind. The calls got shorter. By 2022, I was seeing Marcus twice a year if things went well. I told myself this was normal, that I'd done my job, which was to raise a man who could stand on his own. I told myself a lot of things. The chest pain started in February of 2023. I noticed them and ignored them for 3 weeks because I had rent due and a doctor's visit copay that wouldn't fit in the budget. Then one Tuesday morning, I walked out to my car and the pavement came up to meet me very quickly. My neighbor, Mrs. Chun, found me and called 911. Triple bypass, the doctor said, within the week, or I might not see 65. I called Marcus from the hospital. It took him 6 hours to call back. Music in the background when he did a charity gala. "Dad, this is really bad timing," he said. I was tough. He said he'd try to come by that weekend after the surgery. He didn't come that weekend or the one after. The surgery was on a Thursday. They wheeled me down at 6 o'clock in the morning, and the last thing I remember before the anesthesia took over was a ceiling tile with a water stain shaped like the state of Florida and a nurse squeezing my hand. I woke up in the ICU sometime that afternoon. The first sensation was pain, not sharp, more like something vast and comprehensive. A pressure that pulsed with my heartbeat. The second was thirst. The third, arriving as my brain came fully online, was the awareness that I was alone. They moved me to a regular recovery room on the second day. For beds, curtain dividers. The man to my left had his wife, daughter, and son-in-law there. Every afternoon, crowded into the space, talking over each other and being asked twice to keep the noise down. The man across from me had an elderly woman sitting perfectly upright in the visitor's chair, watching him sleep. The man to my right had his girlfriend there. When I arrived, when I woke up the next morning, and when I woke up the morning after that, she slept in the chair. She'd brought her own pillow. My curtain was open because there was no one to close it for me. Marcus sent a text the day of my surgery. I saw it when they gave me my phone back. "Good luck, Dad. You've got this." Sent at 6:23 a.m. By that time, his social media had a check-in at a restaurant the night before. I'd seen it because Vanessa had tagged him. Triple bypass morning and he was at dinner. I sat in the ICU with my chest sutured back together and my phone in my hand, and I tried to find an interpretation of this that didn't hurt. And I couldn't. A nurse named Patricia managed most of my care. She was precise in a way that is its own kind of kindness. She noted on my second day that I had no visitors. She didn't say anything about it directly. She just noted it in the way a person notes something they plan to come back to. On the morning of the third day, she told me I was being discharged that afternoon and needed a care plan. Who was picking me up? Who was managing medication? Who would be present for at least the first week of recovery? I told her I'd figure it out. She looked at me over her reading glasses in a way that said she'd heard that before. I tried calling Marcus. Voicemail. Tried again. Then I looked at my phone more carefully, went to his contact, and understood. He had blocked my number at some point between the surgery and that morning. His calls weren't going through. My texts were delivering into a blocked inbox he would never see. I sat with that for a while. Tried to understand it, couldn't. 3 days after his father's open heart surgery, he had blocked my number. The only explanation I could construct was that the accumulated guilt of not being there had reached a level he found unbearable, and his solution was to make it impossible for me to reach him. I have had more than a year to think about this, and I keep arriving at the same place. I was trying to work out whether I could make the first 10 miles on foot when my surgeon appeared in the doorway. Dr. James Morrison, late 60s, silver-haired. The kind of stillness that made a room feel quieter when he entered it. He usually had residents behind him. That afternoon, he was alone. He pulled a chair to my bed and sat down like he had nowhere else to be. He asked about the Riverside route, building 447, January 1989. I went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the hospital. He said I was the medical student on the 3rd floor, working nights at a gas station to cover tuition. 2 weeks from quitting, I'd done the math, and the math said it wasn't possible. Then I went to my mailbox and found an envelope, no return address, $500 in cash, and a folded note. Keep going. Someone believes in you. He said that money covered my textbooks and a month of groceries. But more than that, it told me someone had seen me. I'd been invisible so long that a stranger, noticing for no reason, felt like something I couldn't explain. I kept that note for 15 years. I remembered leaving the envelope, not him specifically. I'd done it a handful of times over the years, whenever I could scrape the money together and felt certain something was wrong behind a particular door. I never told anyone. You see someone drowning, you throw them what you got. He said, I saw your name on the intake form 2 weeks ago and went home and checked my old journals. Same name, same building, same route. I've been looking for the person who sent that envelope for 35 years, and you walked into my hospital. He looked at me steadily. Then he said, I have a proposition. I didn't know what to say. I sat in that bed with my chest aching and tried to find words and couldn't locate any. What I eventually said was, I remember leaving envelopes. I never thought much about it afterward. It wasn't a big thing. It was just what the moment called for. He said it was a very big thing for the person who found it. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then he said, I have a house, a large one. My wife and I bought it when we were both practicing and she was still alive. She died 5 years ago. My children are grown. There are more rooms than I have practical use for. I also have a Nurse who comes in 5 days a week for my own health monitoring. She could extend that oversight to you. You'd have your own room, meals, proper medical support, everything you need for a full recovery. I said, I can't accept that. He said, why not? I was going to say, I have people who can help, but that wasn't true. I had Mrs. Chun, who is 72, and I had a son who had blocked my number. He seemed to understand where I'd stopped and why. He said, this offer is not charity. It is not pity. It is one person responding to what another person did for them 35 years ago. Nothing more complicated than that. I looked out at the parking garage window. There was a crow sitting on a light fixture. I watched it for a moment. I said, I'll pay rent. He looked at me. I said, I'm not staying in your house for free. My pension is modest, but it's consistent. I'll pay you something every month. He said, Thomas, my property taxes alone. I said, then donate it. I don't care what you do with it, but I'm paying. He was quiet. Then he said $200 a month, and I'll put it toward the hospital's cardiac care fund. I said, 300 or I walk. He looked at me with something that might have been amusement. He said, you had open heart surgery 4 days ago. I said, I'm aware. He said, 30. Fine. A car will be here at 2 o'clock. His name is Robert. He walked out. I sat there for a moment. Then I laughed very quietly, which hurt considerably. Robert arrived at 2. He was compact, silver-haired, efficient without being overbearing. He helped me with my bag and guided me to the car with a hand lightly at my elbow that managed to be helpful without being condescending. The drive to Lakeshore Drive took 20 minutes. We went through neighborhoods I had delivered Mylan 40 years ago. The kind where houses sat far back from the street and had names, where the trees were old enough to form canopies over the road, where serious money had been living long enough to become invisible. James' house appeared at the end of a gravel drive lined with oak trees, 3 stories, stone and pale brick, a garden that stretched around the left side, further than I could track from the car. A woman named Helen was waiting inside. She introduced herself as my nurse for the recovery period, told me she had my medication schedule from the hospital's discharge notes, and said she'd be checking on me 3 times daily and was on call overnight. She said this the way a person says something they intend to follow through on. She showed me to a room on the first floor, fireplace, window overlooking the garden, a bathroom with a walk-in shower, and a bench seat, which I understood was planned. The bed was large and covered in what appeared to be actual linen. There were fresh flowers on the nightstand, not a grand arrangement, just a few stems in a clear glass vase. The kind of thing someone does when they want a room to feel welcoming and know how. I sat down on the edge of the bed. Then I lay back carefully and looked at the ceiling. The ceiling was plain white, plaster with no water stains whatsoever. James appeared in the doorway. Dinner at 6 o'clock. Rest now. I was asleep before 6 o'clock. The days that followed had a rhythm I hadn't experienced in years. Helen came at 7 o'clock with medications and vitals. A woman named Maria made breakfast, real food, the kind that tasted like someone had thought about it. Coffee that was better than anything I'd made in my apartment for years. James would come in as I was finishing and pour himself a cup and sit across from me, and we'd talk about nothing in particular. The news, something he'd read some case from his rounds, described in terms general enough to protect privacy. He chose words carefully and meant what he said. I found this restful. Helen had me walking. By day 4, The garden was the destination, which was enough. It was longer than the distance from my apartment to the end of my old block. James walked with me on the first 2 mornings, setting a pace slow enough that I didn't feel managed. He told me his wife, Margaret, had designed the garden herself over 20 years. He said she had wanted it to look like something that had always been there. He said she had largely succeeded. He asked about Marcus on the 5th day. Not intrusively, the conversation arrived there naturally. I told him the basic facts. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "Do you think Marcus knows he hurt you?" I said, "I think he knows and has decided not to." Looked directly at it. He said, "That's a specific kind of failure, not absence of conscience. Presence of conscience plus inability to tolerate what it's telling you." I said, "I raised him better than that." He said, "I believe you. I also think the people we raise become people we didn't raise. They accumulate experience and damage we didn't put there. And sometimes those things change them in ways we didn't anticipate. That isn't a failure of parenting. It's just a fact about people." I said, "It doesn't feel like just a fact." He said, "No, it wouldn't." We walked in silence. The morning was cold and bright, the kind where the light is very clear and everything has sharp edges. He said, "In 35 years of cardiac surgery, the variable I found most consistently predictive of recovery, not the only one, but the most consistent that isn't purely physiological, is whether someone shows up, whether there are people who are present, who ask questions, who bring food, who stay later than they need to. People who have someone in the room recover faster, have fewer complications, are more adherent to their follow-up care. It isn't mystical, but it's real." I said, "What's your point?" He said, "My point is that you deserve to have someone in the room, and I'm glad you're here." I didn't have a good answer for that. I just kept walking. The evenings were the part one didn't expect. James was usually home by 7 o'clock. Most evenings after dinner, he'd end up in the library across from my bedroom, and if my door was open, we'd drift into conversation. He read constantly everything and had strong opinions about books, the way some people have opinions about sports teams. He'd leave things propped against my door frame with a note that said, "Try this," or "You'd like this," or "This is terrible, but I can't stop." I started reading more than I had in years. He told me about Margaret in pieces, not mournfully. He'd had 5 years to work through the grief, and he'd done that, you could tell. But he'd mention her the way you mention someone who is woven into everything, because he'd met her in their 3rd year of medical school. She'd been in pediatrics. She died of ovarian cancer 14 months from diagnosis to end, and he had been present for all of it with the particular devastation of a person who understands exactly what is happening and cannot stop it. He asked about Sarah. In return, I told him what I could. The way she'd made our apartment feel larger by filling it with plants and noise and the particular energy of someone very much alive. The way Marcus looked like her around the eyes. James listened carefully, the same way he listened to everything. 10 days into my stay, Marcus called. Not my cell. He couldn't reach that. He'd called the hospital, who had his name as next of kin, and routed him to James' line, which I put down as my emergency contact. Helen knocked on my door during lunch. She said, "Your son is on the line." I took the phone into the garden. I needed to be outside for this. His voice when he came on was careful, The specific carefulness of a person who does know they've done something wrong and is trying to find the right register to open with. He said, "Hey." I said, "Hey." He asked how I was feeling. I told him I said I'd had major surgery and spent the first 3 days recovering without a visitor. He said he wanted to come see me. He'd heard I was staying somewhere. The hospital wouldn't give an address. He asked where I was. I asked who told him I was staying somewhere. The pause lasted exactly long enough to answer my question. I gave him the address. Sunday at 2. Then I went inside and told James. He set down his coffee cup very deliberately. He said, "Did he say how he found out where you were?" I said, "He said the hospital told him I'd been discharged to a private residence." James said someone told him whose private residence. He said, "Thomas, I had my attorney look into your son this week. I want to be clear that I did this to understand the situation fully, not to build a case. What I found is that Marcus is in financial trouble. His firm has lost significant clients. He took out a second mortgage. His personal financial position is fragile in ways he has probably not fully disclosed to anyone. And I think there's a real possibility that someone connected his name to this address and that it accelerated his timeline for getting in touch." I said, "He's my son. He's not purely calculating." James said, "I believe you, and I think a person can have genuine feelings and respond to opportunities simultaneously. Those things aren't mutually exclusive. I've asked my attorney to be available Sunday afternoon, quietly in the study just in case I wanted to argue with him. But the part of me that had raised Marcus, that knew every register of his voice, that part wasn't entirely sure James was wrong. I went to bed and lay awake, thinking not about Sunday, but about a 7-year-old in a parking lot crying into my shoulder, asking me to promise. I still believed I'd kept that promise. I just wasn't sure it had been the right one to make. Sunday came in cold and overcast. I was up early. Helen found me in the kitchen at 6:30 with a cup of coffee and my hands wrapped around it. She took my vitals, confirmed my medications, and made me breakfast. Without comment, James came down at 8. He poured his coffee and stood at the island across from me. He said, "How are you?" I said, "I've been better. Emotionally is the bigger number." He nodded. He said, "Whatever happens this afternoon, you are allowed to feel whatever you feel. You don't have to perform equanimity." I said, "I've been performing equanimity for 64 years. It's somewhat automatic at this point." He smiled. He said, "That may be something to address eventually." At 2 o'clock, I heard the car. Marcus' voice in the entry hall was the first thing. Too warm, slightly amplified. The register he used in professional settings where he needed a room to like him. He appeared in the doorway and he looked good in the way people look good when their clothes fit and their haircuts are recent. He had Sarah's eyes. He always had Sarah's eyes. And they always landed on me in a specific way. He came to me and hugged me carefully in a way that was partly about my chest and partly about something else. His hand on my back was brief but real. He said, quietly, "I'm sorry I wasn't there." "Dad," I said, "we'll talk about it." Then he turned to James, put the voice on, warm, direct, professionally assured. He said, "Dr. Morrison, Marcus Reeves, I can't begin to thank you for what you've done for my father." James said evenly, "Your father and I have a long history. It's been my pleasure to finally meet him properly. Vanessa had moved into the room the way she moved. Into rooms, peripheral assessment, disguised as casual interest. Her eyes tracked the artwork, the ceilings, the particular quality of the house that announced old money without announcing it. James told the story. The Riverside. Route Building 447, January 1989. He told it with the same precision he'd used with me, watching Marcus's face. While he spoke, I watched Marcus' face. 2. Something happened in it partway through. The listening began as professional engagement and shifted as James continued into something more internal. His jaw moved slightly. He looked for a moment at his hands. When James finished, Marcus said, I didn't know he did things like that. James said, your father has been doing things like that his entire life, quietly, without wanting recognition. Marcus said, yeah, that tracks. He said it. Simply, no performance in it. It was the first thing he'd said since arriving. That sounded like himself. I noticed. Vanessa glanced at him. James suggested showing Marcus the house. Said I looked like I could use some rest, which was partly true and partly a way of getting Marcus alone. Vanessa followed after a few minutes, tracking some internal signal. I sat by the fire and waited. 30 minutes later, Marcus came back alone. He sat across from me. He looked at the fire. Then he said, Dad, I need to be honest with you about why I'm really here. I said, okay. He said, I'm in trouble. The firm has been losing ground. I took out a second mortgage. Vanessa and I have been spending beyond what the income can carry, and I haven't been able to look at it directly. And when someone told me whose house you were staying in, I stopped. I said, you thought there was something here you could use? He nodded. Didn't look at me. I said, and is that the only reason you're here? A long pause. Then, no, I don't think so. I think I've been ashamed of failing. You didn't raise me to fail, and I've been failing, and I didn't know how to look you in the eye and say that, so I just didn't. I avoided it, and then I let the avoidance let it become something I can't explain without sounding like a worse person than I want to be. I said, you are not a bad person, Marcus. You are a person who has been making bad choices. Those are different things, and the difference matters. He said, Dr. Morrison offered me something, a financial arrangement with conditions. I said, I know. He said, the conditions are about you, about showing up, a calling, actually being present. I said, yes. He said, are you okay with that? If I accept, I said, I'm okay with the conditions, but Marcus, if the calls become obligations and the visits become checkboxes, I will know. I've known you since before you were born. I can't hear the difference between you showing up and you performing showing up. He said, I know the difference. 2. I want to do the first one. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the sky had shifted from gray to the pale that comes just before snow. He said, Dad, I need to ask you something. After Mom died, were there times when you wanted to just leave, when it felt like too much? I said, there were times when it felt like too much. Plenty of those. But wanting to leave, no, that thought never came. You were the reason there was still a point to anything. Leaving was never on the table. He was quiet for a long time. Then I didn't know that. I think I built up the idea that you were just naturally capable of all of it. That it wasn't hard for you. I said, I was made exactly the same as everyone else. I just decided what I was going to do and did it every day until it was done. He said, "That's what I mean. That's the thing I don't know how to do." I said, "Marcus, that's not a special quality. That's just choosing." He said, "I haven't been very good at choosing lately." I said, "You're here. That's choosing." He came every Saturday. For the next 8 weeks, the calls were Tuesdays and Thursdays, which settled into place without our having to decide it. By the end of March, the first snow drops were up in the far garden. Marcus was there the day they appeared. He crouched down to look at them, and I stood beside him, and neither of us said anything, and it was the most comfortable silence we'd shared in years. James found me in the sitting room after they left. He poured 2 small glasses from a decanter on the side table and pushed one toward me and looked at me. He said, "Well," I said. "Well," he said, "I released my attorney from the study about halfway through my conversation with Marcus." I said, "What happened between you two?" He said he was working hard in the early part to establish a particular kind of relationship, the kind that involves mutual respect and a shared investment in your well-being and a certain positioning of himself as someone useful to know. It was skillfully done. Then I told him I knew about the second mortgage and the client losses and his firm's position. He went very still, and then I made him an offer. I said, "What kind of offer?" He said, "I want to discuss it with you first because it concerns you. I'd like to make Marcus a one-time financial arrangement enough to address the most acute elements of his situation and give him room to breathe. With conditions. The conditions are about his relationship with you, real engagement, not performance. He calls you twice a week. He visits once a month. Minimum. He enters financial counseling. He tells Vanessa the full picture of their finances. No more managing around the edges. And he stays entirely out of my financial affairs now and forever. No. Asks no leveraging this connection. If any of those conditions fail, the money returns to me with interest. I said, and if they don't fail, he said, then he gets to keep it and learns what it feels like to stand back up after falling with help from someone who didn't need to help him. I said, I don't know if he'll accept it. James said he's at the point where his options are narrowing. People become willing to accept conditions when the alternative is bad enough, and I think watching you negotiate your rent this afternoon had some effect. He told me about it. He seemed unsettled by it in a productive way. I thought about Marcus in the sitting room, his head in his hands. I think he's still in there, he'd said. I said, let me talk to him on my own without an agenda before anything with attorneys, and then we'll see. James said, of course. He raised his glass slightly. I raised mine. In the months that followed, James and I settled into the life of the house the way people settle into things that are right. Gradually, without announcement, until one day you look up and realize it's been weeks since anything felt strange. He was a better friend than most of the people I'd known for decades. He was honest in a way that was rare, not blunt, not unkind, but without the padding most people put around the truth when they're not sure you can handle it. He seemed to assume I could handle it, which I found I could. He asked me in April to stay permanently. We were in the library after dinner. The fire was going. He was at his desk. He said, without looking up, I've been thinking about whether to say this directly or let it develop naturally. I've decided direct is more honest. He said, I'd like you to stay here not as a convalescent and not as a paying tenant, though I appreciate the principle of it, as someone who lives here as family, if that's a word that fits. I recognize this is a significant thing to propose, but I've arrived at the conclusion that the life in this house is better with you in it. You are interesting. You are honest in a way that is somewhat rare. You make me think about things differently, and I am 69 years old with a pacemaker and a house that is too large and a habit of working too late because the alternative is the silence. I would like the silence to be optional rather than mandatory. I said, $500 a month, non-negotiable, donated to wherever you want. He looked at me. I said, and I keep my library card. The Columbus Public Library System is a civic treasure, and I won't give it up because I've changed addresses. He said, your library card is not in any danger. I said, and I want to keep cooking with Maria at least twice a week. She's been teaching me things, and I intend to continue. He said, Maria will be delighted. She has opinions about your knife skills that I will not repeat. I said, she's not wrong. He smiled. He said, so you'll stay? I said, I'll stay. He nodded once and went back to his laptop. I picked up my book. The fire made its quiet sounds. That was how I came to live in a house on Lakeshore Drive in Columbus, Ohio at the age of 64 and discover that the last chapter of a life can be the best one. The months that followed had a shape I hadn't expected, not dramatic. The books and movies would have you believe that when something good comes into your life, after a long, hard stretch, it arrives with sunrise light and the feeling that you can look back and see exactly how all the pieces led here. That isn't how it felt. It felt gradual and occasionally confusing and sometimes still lonely because the people I'd loved most were still gone. And a good life in a beautiful house doesn't change that. Sarah was still gone. Gerald was still gone. The 37 years of routes were behind me and not ahead, but something had shifted. What had shifted, I eventually understood, was that I was no longer invisible. I had been invisible for a long time, not to Marcus, not entirely, not when he was young and I was the whole of his world, but to the rest of it, to the world that measures a person's worth by their salary and their address and the label on their jacket. I had walked those routes and been largely invisible to the people whose mail I delivered, present enough to be useful, not present enough to be a person. I had found ways to make the invisibility meaningful, even the envelopes, the small moments of noticed suffering. You can do real things from invisibility, but it carries a cost. James saw me. It is the simplest way to put it. He saw me the way the envelope had seen that medical student in 1989, not as a category or a function, but as a specific person with a specific history that had value. Being seen like that at 64 after a lifetime of useful invisibility, it made the world feel larger. It made me feel like there was more of my life ahead than I thought. Marcus came every Saturday through spring and into summer. The calls were Tuesdays and Thursdays, which we'd established without discussing it. The calls were real, not the managed pleasantries of before. He told me about the firm, which had stabilized by May, partly from the financial breathing room and partly from a new client he landed. Through 6 months of exhausting business development, he told me about Vanessa, who had taken a job managing communications for a nonprofit and who had surprised him at every stage. He Told me about therapy, both useful and occasionally horrible, he said. I told him that meant it was working. James and I went to Maine in July. His friend, Arthur, had a house on the coast, and we ate lobster on a dock and walked on a beach too cold for swimming, but exactly right for walking. And I read on a porch overlooking the water and had no desire to be anywhere else. I called Marcus from that porch on a Tuesday. He asked where I was. I told him there was a brief silence, and then he said, good, just that good. But there was something in his voice adjacent to relief, and I heard it clearly. In September, Marcus and Vanessa came for dinner. Vanessa was different, not unrecognizable, but different, a new quality of attention, less performing and more present. She and James ended up in a conversation about hospital governance that lasted 40 minutes and from which neither of them appeared to want to escape. After dinner, Marcus and I sat in the garden until almost 11 o'clock. He told me he'd been thinking about whether to keep doing what he was doing or find something else, work that felt connected to people rather than to process. I told him that was worth thinking about carefully from a position of choice rather than panic. He said he was trying to learn the difference. I said that's one of the harder ones. He said, Dad, I want to say something. I said, okay. He said, I know I missed a lot. I know I let the distance grow and then let it become an excuse and then let the excuse become a habit. I know sorry is a limited word for what that was, but I want you to know I see it now. All of it. The jacket, the lunches, Golden Corral. I see what you gave me, and I understand what it cost. I didn't say anything for a moment. He said, I think I needed to fail to understand it, which is a terrible way to have to learn something about your father. I said, most of the things worth learning come the hard way. He said, is that wisdom or just something that's true? I said, I'm not sure there's a difference. He laughed. He had his mother's laugh. The way it arrived without announcement. I'd thought I'd forgotten that. I hadn't. He came every Saturday, and every Saturday I walked a little further in the garden until by October I could make the full loop without stopping past the winter E-night and the dormant kitchen beds and the far wall where the snowdrops would come up again in January, February at the latest. James found me by that far wall one afternoon in late October. He stood beside me and looked at the bare ground and said, Margaret always said the thing she loved most about this garden was that it kept its promises. Whatever she planted in autumn, it came up in spring every year. It never failed her. I said, she sounds like someone worth knowing. He said, she was the best person I ever met. Present company, becoming increasingly competitive. I looked at him. He shook his head, slightly embarrassed in the way dignified people get embarrassed, which is barely perceptibly, but real. He said, that was overly sentimental. Forgive me. I said, don't apologize for it. We stood there a while longer. The light was going, the October light that leaves early and leaves the garden blue, gray, and still. It was the kind of quiet that doesn't need to be filled. That winter, Marcus came with Vanessa for Christmas. It was the first Christmas we'd spent together in 4 years. We ate in the dining room, the big one which James had been apologetic about using for just 2 people all these years, but which was exactly right for 5. Maria made something extraordinary. James opened a bottle of wine that Robert had apparently been waiting for an occasion to justify. Vanessa told a story about something that had gone wrong at her job in a way that was genuinely funny. Marcus told a story about a deposition that had gone sideways that was even funnier. James and I laughed. We ate too. Much. Afterward, James and I stood in the kitchen while Marcus and Vanessa did the dishes, which they'd insisted on. And James said very quietly, "This is what this room was built for." I said, "I know." He said, "Thank you, Thomas." I said, "For what?" He said, "For the envelope and for everything after." I didn't have an answer for that. The kitchen was warm and the voices in the dining room carried through the wall. Marcus and Vanessa's talking while they worked, and outside through the kitchen window, the garden was dark and cold and full of things that were only waiting. I thought, I will see them come up in spring and the year after that. Then I poured myself the last of the wine, and James and I stood at the kitchen island and listened to our children cleaning up in the next room, and it was without drama or announcement the best Christmas I'd had in 30